Ali, welcome to the Reset Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I've been following along with you for a little while now, so this just felt like the perfect opportunity to meet.
Aww.
Yes.
Well, some of our Reset community are probably already following you online, but for those who don't, can you just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Ali. I'm a clinical psychologist based up in Brisbane. I mostly work with a lot of high achievers, which is maybe why there's a nice little Venn diagram of our followers. A lot of women who struggle with perfectionism and burnout, and a lot of ADHD clients as well. I work in solo private practice, which is where my business Congruence was born. And I also opened a shared space called Home Based Therapy Collective, which is for a lot of allied health to kind of come together and be under this one little tin roof of a Queenslander in Paddington, but we can still feel connected and empower each other to work for ourselves. And I just wanted to create a space that really gives back to the allied health community because it's tricky to find that. Yeah.
That sounds really beautiful. And I know a lot of allied health practitioners do work alone, which can be quite lonely and isolating.
Yeah, for sure. And that was one of the primary reasons for wanting to open Home Base, because it's so hard to do what we do, I think, especially as psychologists. It's a lot to hold. And then to kind of the client leaves and to come out of session and you just have that big wave of aloneness sort of hit you. So being able to even just have those little moments as you're passing each other in the hallway and then coming together for lunch really helps break up that loneliness, I think. Yeah.
Beautiful. So today I've invited you here to talk all about ADHD. I feel like it's popping up everywhere at the moment. A lot of celebrities are coming out and saying that they have been diagnosed later in life with ADHD. A lot of my friends and a lot of my clients, they're kind of going through this tricky to navigate scenario of, wait, as a child, I didn't have it. Why do I have it now? So thank you so much for coming. I think it's really topical and really important. Can you explain to us just ADHD 101? What is it?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. It's gone through a few iterations in the last couple of years or maybe the last 10 years. So it was called ADD and ADHD for a while, but now we just have a blanket term of ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorder, which is kind of a silly name for it because it's not necessarily that ADHDers have a deficit or a lack of attention, but rather they have too much and struggle to keep it on the things that they want to keep it on. There are 3 different types of ADHD broadly. So there's the hyperactive or impulsive type. This is kind of the type that I think people picture when they think of ADHD, right? So it's the little kid that's jumping off the walls and can't sit still in school. And that's predominantly where a lot of the diagnoses went for a really long time. So we also didn't used to think that women could have ADHD. So it was a lot of little boys getting that early diagnosis. The second type of ADHD is the inattentive, predominantly inattentive type. So this is a lot more of difficulty with focusing, organising, managing tasks. Often there's something that I call task snowballing that can happen, which is maybe you start one thing, so you start washing the dishes or something like that, and then you look over and you see like, oh, the bin needs to be taken out. So you stop halfway and then you walk over to the bin and you're tying up the bin and then you're like, oh man, there's so much dust on the floor, I need to vacuum. So you go pick up the vacuum. And that goes on and on and on. And you realise that you've got all of these half-finished tasks and then suddenly you're late to get to work because you haven't kept to time. So it can be really distressing to have the inattentive type as well. The third type is really just a combination of the two. So a mix of those two symptoms. One set of symptoms that seems to be underrepresented or underdiagnosed is that the hyperactivity isn't necessarily just physical hyperactive symptoms, so the jitteriness or bouncing off the walls, but it can also be verbal. So that can be things like interrupting others or finishing people's sentences or just really struggling to stop talking. So those symptoms are being picked up on a lot more recently.
What about males and females? Does it typically present differently in different genders?
That's a really good question. I think short answer is yes, but I'd love to give a little bit of an analogy that one of my colleagues has gifted to me a few weeks ago, which is if you think of a person with ADHD as like a stove, and a stove has all of the different dials that you can turn up to different levels. So some are off completely, some are really low, some are really high, some are in the middle. if you think of those dials as like different symptoms of ADHD, so one might be difficulty with focusing, or one might be the sensory sensitivities that come with ADHD, which can be, difficulty with loud noises and bright lights. One might be the verbal kind of word vomit, not being able to stop talking. And each person is going to have a different level of those symptoms. To answer your question about the gender differences, there are gender differences, but there might be other reasons for that going on rather than it being something that's biologically determined. For example, I think if we consider the boys will be boys kind of analogies that boys are given at a young age, they might be more allowed, or it might be more acceptable for them to be bouncing off the walls and to have a lot of energy. Whereas for women, I think we get taught at a really young age to suppress that kind of behaviour and to be good and to be quiet. So there might have been a number of young women specifically, who had those more hyperactive symptoms and difficulties, but the impact of their gender role might have made them suppress it and have to adapt and mask a lot more than maybe boys had to. So now we're seeing a really big wave of unmasking in adult women, where they're realising like, I do have all these difficulties and actually is really hard, but I just spend so much energy in my day trying to suppress that and keep it under control. Yeah.
So is ADHD something that you're born with, or does it develop over time because of our environment and our circumstances?
So it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means we're born with it. So any kind of neurodivergence is something that we're born with, including autism spectrum disorder and things like that. In terms of how it can change over time, it certainly can, but most likely for a number of environmental and lifestyle reasons. So in childhood, we might experience certain symptoms in a bigger way because we're stuck in school and it's really hard to sit there and focus. And then in adulthood, we have a number of other stresses that can come about, like relationships and financial issues and careers and things like that. So the symptoms or the things that we might struggle with might start to shift and change over time as a result of those other kinds of pressures.
I feel like for some celebrities that have come out recently and said, hey, I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD, they're wearing it like a badge of honour in a way, and there's a lot of superpowers there that come with it. Is it harmful or not harmful to kind of glorify ADHD? Like, I feel like recently I've been thinking, do I want to be diagnosed with ADHD? Is it a good thing? Like, can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, to be honest, the answers are going to vary in the community. So it's kind of important for me to probably note that early on, that I might have a certain idea or opinion around it and other people might not agree with it. But when we talk about ADHD being like a superpower, I think that can be difficult for some people because it is a disorder at the end of the day, and it does present with a number of really debilitating difficulties alongside it. So as well as all of those symptoms that we experience on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of like having the outside lane to the same race as everyone else. And so, yeah, we might get to the finish line, even at the same time as others, but the work and the effort, and like I was talking about before, the energy that gets put into running that race is significantly more. So it's important to kind of note that. At the same time, I think if the world was made to benefit people with ADHD, we would see an incredible benefit coming from things like hyperfocus, which is the ability to almost like dopamine dump on something that's really interesting and really engaging and just absolutely smash something out. So being able to focus for hours and hours and hours on something that's really interesting. So when we think about, celebrities or people in the public eye, I suppose a lot of them might be creatives. They might be working in these high pressure, fast paced environments where we are actually going to see symptoms of ADHD really thrive. So those symptoms may have benefited them for a long time in that space. There's so many benefits, so many sort of quote unquote superpowers to come from ADHD, but it's easy for that to get lost as this glorified idea of, it's this amazing thing that we have, when it can be really difficult at the same time.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because I know some people are on the fence of maybe I have these traits, but I don't want to be diagnosed because of the label. Or I've spoken to some parents recently who think maybe they're children, but again, they're just concerned of whether a label can be harmful or helpful. What are your thoughts on that?
For sure. I think, again, personally, and having worked with kids for a long time, a lot of neurodiverse kids as well, who are just the best. I think that early intervention, early diagnosis is really, really important for a number of reasons. One is that, the sooner we know, the better in terms of the support and access to support that they can have in school. So, when they start to hit those schooling years, like age 6, age 7, you're going to potentially start noticing if they do have difficulties that, maybe it's harder for them to focus at school, or they're getting in trouble, they're getting corrected a lot. There's a lot of statistics, I suppose, around how children who are undiagnosed with ADHD are going to be corrected, 20,000 times more than a child who doesn't have ADHD by the time they're like 12. So, which is really, really upsetting considering they don't know that they're doing anything wrong, and they have a real difficulty in stopping themselves from being able to do these things. So the earlier the better in terms of getting support and having the people around them, especially the family, understand what's going on for them so that they know that they're not being naughty and they're not just being defiant most of the time, but actually that they're just really struggling. And there are ways that you can deliver information and provide support, especially at school, so that they can sort of get through those days a little bit easier. Especially what I see in, I guess, a lot of adult clients that I work with now who went undiagnosed for most of their life. They're getting to their 20s and 30s before they're being recognised as having ADHD. When you aren't diagnosed your entire life and you're facing these situations of always struggling to finish things on time, seeming like everyone else around you can just do things easier than you, being corrected, maybe getting in trouble, you create a system of understanding to make sense of that, because that's all we want to do as humans is try and figure out, why am I the way that I am and why do things feel like this for me? And if you don't have any other tangible reason, like a disorder that you can't help, you're going to turn that lens inwards and say, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my ability to do things compared to other people. And so I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't know how to do these things like everyone else, and so I'm not even going to try. So I have so many beautiful people sitting on my couch in my office saying these things, even though they are some of the most incredibly capable, incredibly intelligent, empathetic people who really have so much potential, but because they didn't know that they had these difficulties, they thought it was their fault, and so they don't let themselves have the opportunity now. So being able to afford that to someone, a young person, and going, hey, it's not you. You've got this thing that works against you, but let's create a system and an environment that helps, just means that maybe those core beliefs, those self-beliefs won't develop quite so much as they seem to when we don't have the diagnosis.
That's so powerful. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that are thinking, okay, you're talking to me. I feel really seen. I feel really heard. If anyone's listening and thinking that, what's the steps they should take?
So the most efficient way, at least in Queensland, it might vary from state to state, to be honest, but it would be to go to if you're an adult, to go to your GP and get a referral to a psychiatrist. Now, keeping in mind, this isn't to scare people off from the process at all, but more to just forewarn that it is a bit of a lengthy and stepped process. And so we need to keep that in mind, that it's not going to be a one-stop shop at the GP. So the GP will sort of ask you a couple of questions and assess you and then pass you on to a psychiatrist. Then the psychiatrist appointment the wait here in Queensland at the moment is anywhere between 3 and 6 months. So you're waiting a little bit. You might have some measures and some questionnaires that you need to do in the meantime. You might also need to access your school reports if they're available, so that they can see that this has been something that's existed over time. Because like we were talking about, we sort of have to see evidence that this has been a problem since you were a young person. Otherwise, it might be indicating that something else was going on in your adulthood that's more relevant. Then we go to the psychiatrist. There's often an informant or a family member that is able to give extra information, especially about how you grew up. So maybe that's a parent or a caregiver. Again, if that's not available, it might be a partner or someone close to you. And it's sort of between 2 and 3 sessions that they're assessing if you have ADHD, and if so, what type. And then the conversation, if the client is wanting, the conversation can go towards medication and management, and perhaps even a referral to a psychologist, someone who hopefully specialises and works with neurodiverse people and who can provide symptom management and help with some of the executive functioning, which is that kind of control center in our brain. Because even though medication is really helpful for a number of things, it doesn't necessarily take away every single symptom, and it doesn't help really at all with some of the executive functioning symptoms like not finding things interesting or difficulty with managing and starting tasks, but it does really help with focusing and keeping calm in certain situations. So yeah, that process is lengthy, and you're looking at anywhere between, for the whole thing, sort of 6+ months. But if you're considering it, it's absolutely worth exploring. Something else that's really important to note, I feel would be remiss not to, is that this is a conversation of privilege as well. Because in Australia, in order to access a GP, there are bulk billed GPs, sure, but in order to access a psychiatrist is a conversation around financials, and it's expensive. There's a big financial burden in accessing these appointments, multiples of these appointments, and having the ability to get yourself there, get to appointments. So we don't really have accessible healthcare in this domain in Australia for people who are really struggling and who would really benefit from a diagnosis. So, yeah.
Okay, so if someone's in that situation and they're thinking, this sounds like it could be me, I don't have the time or resources right now to go through the formal process, what are some things they could do to start understanding and managing the traits that they experience on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question. I think people sort of hesitate to do the self-diagnosis thing, and sure, like you can't self-diagnose, it's not possible. We need psychologists and psychiatrists to do that. But if a lot of these symptoms resonate with you, that's valid and that's relevant, and they don't necessarily have to meet a diagnosis for them to be causing difficulties for you. So if you have trouble focusing, if you have difficulties with emotion regulation, which is a really big one in people with ADHD, we really struggle to keep our cool, especially if certain triggers get pushed. It's important to find support and find access to information around those symptoms. So that can be online communities, it can be, even though it has its problems at times, social media and things like that can really help with that sense of relatability, like, oh, this works, for this person and maybe it'll work for me. We just always have to take things with a grain of salt and know that just because it works for them doesn't mean it's going to work for us as well. But it's important to keep trying and not just sort of have to accept that, okay, well, this is just hard for me and so I can't really do anything about it. There's lots that can be done. The best case scenario, though, would be that you somehow can access support, whether that's psychological therapy, counselling, or seeing a psychiatrist at some point down the line.
Let's jump back a little bit to the social media discussion. So are environmental factors, like right now, our attention span, I feel like almost 100% of the population is so short. Is that exaggerating traits of ADHD by any chance?
That is such a good question, Ash, and I'm so glad you asked, because I do feel that more globally, we're having a lot of dopamine dependence. And when I'm talking about dopamine, that's a chemical in our brain that almost acts as a bit of a reward center. So if we consider social media and the internet and how we're constantly being given very quick, very rapid information that's super engaging and super fun, we're going to get really addicted to that. We're just wired like that. Some people more than others, ADHDers especially, have that dopamine deficit in the brain, and that's what we think and what we understand about what goes on in an ADHD brain. So they're going to be much more likely to be drawn to content, drawn to things that give us dopamine. So I think globally we're seeing issues there with the rapidity of information and a need to access information, a lot of distress if we can't. And it almost acts like an addiction. If we are asked to sort of have a detox from our phones or detox from social media, people show symptoms of withdrawal, which is really interesting. They get cranky, they get frustrated, they get restless, they struggle to sleep when they have to detox from their phone, which shows us that, there is something addictive about what's going on, and we become really reliant on those forms of entertainment. Yes.
Is there an increase in the number of people in the world that have ADHD, or is it just an awareness now?
It's hard to say. technically, because it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, there wouldn't be anything that's increasing it from that regard because you're born with it. At the same time, I think that access to information, it's a catch-22, right? On one hand, I'm saying, rapidity and access to information has its problems, but its benefits are that people can understand what the symptoms look like. And so we are seeing a massive boom in diagnoses for sure. I think clinicians as well, psychologists and psychiatrists, are becoming more skilled in identifying it in clients that otherwise we may not have in the past. Because if we think about ADHD, it acts like a bit of a Venn diagram where the circles of other disorders and other problems overlap in a big way. If we think about anxiety disorder, for example, you're going to see restlessness, difficulty sleeping, difficulty focusing sometimes, issues with emotion regulation as well. All of those symptoms exist in a person with ADHD. If we look at autism, we're going to have sensory difficulties, that struggling with the bright lights and sounds, social anxiety and things like that, which can show up in anxiety disorders and ADHD too. So it's important to note that there is a lot of overlap with those things, but maybe in the past we've just put it down to, oh, it's just anxiety or it's just, OCD or something like that, when there are other types of criteria that are showing us now that we have the ability to diagnose ADHD more readily and more accurately too. The other side of things, Ash, is that the criteria was actually not written for women at all, because up until about 10, 15 years ago, we didn't think that ADHD could exist in women at all. So it was exclusively diagnosed in men. So now we have over 50% of the population that's opened up with the ability to be diagnosed in the last 10 to 15 years. So we are, just for that reason alone, going to see a massive boom in diagnoses.
I feel like our listeners are probably, their minds are expanding so much with this. So thank you.
Oh, that's okay.
Is ADHD hereditary?
Yes. Absolutely. We know, if a child has ADHD, it's very likely that they've gotten that from one of their parents or someone in their family line. So what I'm seeing a lot of actually is parents who I work with whose child maybe recently was diagnosed with ADHD, and they start going, this feels familiar, and the things that they're seeing in their child, which maybe are frustrating or annoying behaviours, they're going, I used to struggle with that a lot, and it just never got picked up, especially mums, for that reason around that it wasn't diagnosable in women, especially at their age. So, having a lot of parents have that realisation now, which is really wonderful for them to be able to explore those symptoms in themselves and then also be able to relate to their little ones too, and understand that they're not just being naughty and they're not just being defiant, again, most of the time, but actually they might be struggling, and that they can kind of help each other understand that more.
Yeah, I know a few people in that situation, and it's been really empowering and almost like a bonding opportunity for the parent and the child. Yeah. Is it guaranteed, if someone's listening and they know that they have ADHD and they're thinking of planning a family in the future, do you know what the likelihood of their child having ADHD is?
There isn't a specific number that's able to be quoted, like we can't say there's a 50% chance or anything like that. It is definitely there. The other thing to note, I guess, is that for one reason or another, people with neurodivergence tend to flock together. So we find that people who maybe even were undiagnosed with ADHD, their partner, their friends, the people around them all happen to have some sort of neurospice, neurodivergence going on, which is actually really wonderful in terms of relatability and understanding. So that, again, is more of an anecdotal thing. But if we consider how, we might be more inclined to partner up with someone who's also neurodivergent, then their child has a greater chance, obviously, if both sides have it. But there's no specific number that we can put it to, no.
And then what do we need to know if we have a friend or a partner that has ADHD, and specifically if it's a new diagnosis? How can we be there for them?
For sure. I think in short, my answer would be to ask them. If they have been living with themselves for a long time, they know what upsets them. They might know what triggers them. Not necessarily everyone. Some people's insight is stronger than others, but they might know that, they really struggle with sensory difficulties. They don't like when you're chewing really loudly next to them. They might really struggle when, you give them unsolicited feedback. You tell them like, maybe you could try and rewrite your answers to that interview in a different way or whatever it might be. Not speaking from experience at all, but there might be very specific things that they're aware of are a problem and are very likely related to their ADHD for one reason or another. This leads me to talk a little bit about something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD. Again, this is something that isn't exclusive to ADHD. It can exist in other mental illnesses like anxiety, borderline personality disorder, other trauma-based disorders too. But it is this sense that we might be particularly sensitive to feeling like we've been rejected, or someone said no to us, or we haven't done a good enough job at something. And that kind of comes back to that set of core beliefs that are built over time when we're not diagnosed, where we go, there's something wrong with me, I'm bad, I'm not good enough, you know. So if we have any evidence from the world that confirms that sense, it's world ending. You know, our mood absolutely plummets. We feel so reactive, might get super defensive as well. So for people who are living with someone or close to someone with ADHD, knowing that that might be a particular trigger for them is really important in helping understand how we can deliver information or go about communicating with this person. But yes, I think a big thing is just asking them, being patient, helping them write out these symptoms, and understanding that there might be things you're asking of them that are physically impossible at times, like asking them to focus on something that's really boring. It's not a preference. It's not because they don't want to, or they're lazy, or they're bored of it, or something like that. It's because the way that their brain works in those moments, there is a deficit of dopamine happening, which is the way that we engage with content and stimulus. So there's something going on in their brain that's preventing them from doing it. So being really patient and mindful of that for people is really important.
Speaking about these core values and beliefs, is it possible to rewire those in our mind? Do you work with clients around that?
Yes, definitely. It takes a lot of work, a lot of hard work, I think, to help them understand that this actually wasn't your fault. And you were let down by society and by the system because no one was looking and seeing it through this lens, that maybe there was something going on that wasn't your fault. So like a lot of the other work I do, not just within ADHD, but helping people process and understand their experiences, especially as children, that really focuses on knowing that, well, if you were a child, this wasn't your fault, right? You didn't mean to do these things. You didn't mean to develop these behaviors or actions. And in fact, they were probably a survival blueprint that you had to create to cope with whatever was going on for you around you in the environment you grew up in. So it's not dissimilar to that kind of work in helping them unlearn some of those core beliefs and forgiving their younger self for maybe not knowing and mucking things up repeatedly because they didn't have all the information. You can't finish a puzzle if someone's taken 50% of the pieces from you. So yes, that forgiveness and that unlearning process is huge. Another part of it, specifically with neurodivergence and ADHD, is letting them unmask. When we talk about unmasking, we're talking about, you know, that system and that I guess all those coping strategies that they've had to develop over the years to adapt and to mold to society and kind of fit in and just be acceptable to everyone around them, by helping them understand what those behaviors are. You know, for example, you and I here talking, it might be the case that for someone with ADHD, when you're talking, if I had ADHD, it's like, okay, I need to nod. I need to show her that I'm listening. You know, I need to keep paying attention. I can't fiddle with my rings or the thing. So, you know, they've created this system to act quote unquote normal, and it's about helping them understand that, like, hey, let's go, you know, let's get rid of some of that stuff. Let's let go of it, because maybe people will give you a funny look or they won't understand why you're staring out the window while you listen to someone, but we're getting closer and we're approaching a society that's more accepting of that. So it's case by case, I guess, in what the client wants to do to unmask, but it's a big way that they can have more self-acceptance and self-compassion towards themselves.
Oh, that's really beautiful and must be so empowering to work with people on that. If anyone's listening and they're just going to take away one thing from this podcast today, what would you like them to know?
I think that ADHD isn't maybe what we've thought it is in the past. Historically, like I said, we've had a vision of what ADHD looks like, and it literally was exclusively diagnosed in boys and men. So now, I suppose if the symptoms are resonating, it is worth exploring with a health professional if you have the means to. Even if ADHD isn't the diagnosis that you end up with, you are probably having symptoms. If you feel like I said before, you're having difficulty focusing, you have difficulty with rejection or people saying no to you, that is valid and important, and it doesn't have to be ADHD for you to get help to manage those symptoms. So definitely keep talking about it, keep asking about it, keep gathering information, and find a health professional who you feel will listen and understand you, because the most important part with seeking support for your mental health more generally is that you've found someone who you're comfortable with and who feels like safe and understanding of you. Otherwise, you're just not going to get anywhere. So yeah, that's the biggest takeaway, I think.
Oh, beautiful. And it's so nice that you're able to give that to your clients. But what do you do for yourself when life gets really crazy busy? What's your favorite way to reset?
Yes. So one of my wonderful clients gave me a term called home basing, which is actually what inspired the name of the clinic that I opened this year. And so for me, home basing just means really reconnecting with the basics, because for sure, like, it can really get on top of you, especially running two businesses and trying to keep on top of like my fitness and my social life and my partner and all of those things. So yeah, home basing, I suppose, just means stripping everything back down, not spending as much time on my phone. I think that's a really big part of it as well, and reconnecting with sleeping, eating really well, moving my body, doing mindfulness and gratitude and things like that. And then I always find sometimes it takes a couple of days, sometimes it takes a couple of weeks of taking this time to slow things down. But I always find that ends up being a reset. It's hard to talk ourselves into it sometimes when we're on a roll, especially with work, that we're just like, no, I've just got to keep going, and I really need to see these clients and they really need me today. And you can get really bogged down in this sense of urgency to keep doing more and keep pushing. But we will stop whether we like it or not. Either burnout will stop us or we stop ourselves. Those are the only two options. So yeah, home basing is how I reset and get ready to keep moving forward.
Oh, okay. I feel like we all have some homework today of working out what is our version of a home base, and even just jotting it down so that in those times of the chaos, we can look at how do we just come home to ourselves. That's awesome.
Yeah, totally.
Is there a book that has had a really beautiful positive impact on your life?
Yes, there's so many, but one that I read a couple of years ago, maybe last year, in my wonderful girls book club, was called Tuesdays with Maury. It's by an author named Mitch Albom, and it's honestly one of the most impactful books I've ever read. It's about Mitch Albom's visits with his former professor, whose name was Maury Schwartz, during the last few months of his life. So he was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and each Tuesday he goes over to visit Maury, and they discuss life's biggest questions like love and work and family and how to forgive people over your years. And just Maury's reflections on mortality and facing that really highlights the importance of compassion and connecting with other people. And that massively influenced me. So there's a few pages that I sort of have earmarked throughout that book, and some sections that I have highlighted that I suppose during the home basing kind of moments, or just times where I need to really recalibrate and figure out, what are my values here? What's important to me? What do I need to be focusing on to reconnect with myself? I kind of flip open those pages of that book and it really helps. So it's a life change. It's very short for people with short attention spans. Know that it's not a long book at all, but you'll fly through it in a couple of hours if you feel about it the way that I did. So yeah.
Oh, that sounds like a really good one. I haven't read it yet, but I want to. We'll put the link in the show notes so that everyone can find it. Yeah. And speaking of links and show notes and all those good things, Ali, it's been so lovely to have you on the podcast. How can people learn more more about you, how can they find you online?
Sure. Instagram, speaking of social media, I have websites for both Congruence Psychology and Home-Based Therapy Collective. If anyone's interested in reaching out, you can do it via email through my website as well. I also have expression of interest forms on my websites, and I'm so open to connecting with other health professionals or professionals in the space because, again, we really need to prioritize connection in what we do and sharing of information and learning from one another. There is no such thing as an expert in any one space, in my opinion. People can know a lot about a lot, but I guarantee that if you spend time with someone for long enough, you're going to learn something from them. So I would love to meet more people. So yeah, any way you want to connect with me, that would be great.
Oh, magic. Okay, Ali, thank you. This has been such a eye-opening, empowering, beautiful conversation, and I feel like a lot of people are going to come away feeling very seen and heard from this. So thank you so much for being on the Reset podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ash. It's been awesome.
Thank you.